like to extend a very special welcome to Dr. Michelle Leary, one of our board members, and to our panel this evening. We've also got three of our board members with us, three other board members. We've got Carmel, Dennis, and Michael. Our library is located on the lands that was Wurundjeri by Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present, and to the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here or watching online tonight. The PMI Victorian History Library has called Prahran home since 1854, and we're the second oldest public library in Victoria. We have a collection of over 70,000 items, and we take pride in being the sole library in Australia with such a specialised and extensive collection which is available for loan. Our focus remains rooted in local history, housing a wealth of information encompassing most towns in Victoria. A few admin things before we start. The bathroom is through the main door, turn right, and the bathroom door is on your left. Emergency exits through this door, down the corridor, and there's a door there, or down through the main doors behind you. In an emergency, the staff will direct you where to go. Our library staff, Aaron and myself, will be taking photos and videos during tonight's event. If you prefer not to be included, please let us know. Before I hand over to Michelle to introduce our panel, I would like to thank the Australian Archaeological Conservation for the funding we have received to support National Archaeology Week events. I hope you enjoy the delicious food that they have provided for us. Over to you, Michelle. And also, I just want to thank Michelle very, very much for organising tonight's event. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you for the warm welcome and introduction. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming and for showing your support for Melbourne's heritage and archaeology, and for celebrating National Archaeology Week with us, and also for supporting the PMI Victorian History Library. We've prepared a hopefully interesting presentation for you this evening. My colleagues and I presented this talk as two separate conference papers earlier this year at our Victorian Archaeological Conservation conference called at Victoria University. And we thought when the PMI needed some presenters or were looking for interested parties to present for National Archaeology Week, we thought we could bring both of our papers together and present our results from these recent projects that have similar methodological and thematic aspects, and also that showcase the excellent results that are achievable through collaborative archaeological and conservation practice. Our first part of our talk focuses on the excavation and conservation of a rare timber barrel from Little Lonsdale Street, demonstrating how adaptive strategies can stabilise fragile objects while revealing previously unknown historical evidence. The second part of our talk examines an artefact-rich deposit that was uncovered during works for the West Melbourne Tunnel project, and that included more than 200 well-preserved 19th-century shoes that were recovered from the former West Melbourne Swamp. This highlights the challenges of excavating and managing unstable artefacts in difficult conditions, as well as the importance of collaboration between archaeologists, conservators, clients, and regulators. The remarkable preservation of more than 200 leather shoes from the former West Melbourne Swamp offers us tangible insights into social identity, occupation and class, and while the conserved timber barrel reveals Cooperman technology, possible contents and reuse practices from mid to late 19th century central Melbourne. By explaining how archaeologists and conservators collaborate to recover, document and stabilise fragile artefacts, our speakers tonight will increase your awareness of the role that archaeology plays in safeguarding our cultural heritage. So we'll share the speaking amongst the five of us this evening, so you can't see us holding up and down, so please don't be too distracted by that. But before we begin, I thought we should introduce ourselves. So I'm Dr. Michelle Cleary. I'm an archaeologist and heritage advisor, as well as an architect, and I'm the technical director for archaeology and heritage at Dr. Vincent Clark Archaeology and Heritage. We're a team of consulting archaeologists and heritage advisors, historians and spatial data specialists, and we provide a broad range of heritage services to development projects throughout Victoria. And I've worked as an archaeologist on numerous projects, research projects and consulting projects in Australia, Turkey, Uzbekistan and the Republic of Georgia. I've been working with Victorian Heritage since 2011, as well as continuing to lead a research project in Georgia as well, in the Caucasus Mountains. And I just have a great passion for archaeology and heritage in our beautiful city of Melbourne. Ramona, my colleague at Documents Applied Archaeology and Heritage, is our historical archive specialist and team lead. She's worked in this role since 2019, and Ramona has a multidisciplinary understanding of material culture that comes from her background in art and antiques, which is unique in our field, I think, and she combines this with her training and experience in methods and principles of archaeological practice, as well as the administration of object collections and archives. She's currently pursuing her PhD in archaeology at Victoria Uni and is focusing on 19th-century personal items excavated from Melbourne. And then Jamie Houston on the end is another part of our team at Documents Applied. She's an archaeologist and historical artefact assistant and an expert artefact truther. We thank her every day for that. She's worked on numerous archaeological projects in Victoria in her time with us, and her specialist role involves assisting post-excavation processing and management of historical artefacts. This provides a more detailed cataloguing of each object and preparation of numerous historical artefact assemblages, preparing them both for conservation and for long-term storage. She has a personal research interest in historical European dress, footwear and fashion of the 18th and 19th centuries, and we'll see some other examples of Jamie's artefact photography in our slides tonight. And Dr. Holly Jones-Amin is here, and she's an internationally recognised conservator, specialising in modified archaeological conservation and people-centred approaches to material heritage. She's directed conservation archaeological projects across Syria, Georgia, Turkey and Australia, with additional work throughout the Pacific, Southeast Asia, Italy and the Himalayas. And I've had the great privilege of working with Holly on a couple of interesting projects in Gallipoli and Georgia in our time together. She has managed the objects, archaeology and textile consultancy laboratory of the Prahran Conservation Services at the University of Melbourne for over 20 years. But she's currently in a new role as a lecturer in art history and art curation at the University of Melbourne. And she's authored numerous publications and book chapters, but she has a new book coming out, The Cambridge Memories in Archaeology, which is a bit of a buzz, and it's coming out soon. And last but definitely not least is Marissa Griffith. Marissa works as expert conservators, objects conservator at the Prahran Conservation Services within the Robert Cripps Institute at the University of Melbourne. As the objects conservator, Marissa specialises in the conservation of archaeological artefacts as well as commemorative, memorial and heritage work. So she has a diverse range of objects that she works on. She has more than 10 years experience and she works on site with first stage triage of objects as well as condition assessments and surveys of objects. And she also devises conservation treatment plans and proposals. Marissa is committed to securing long-term preservation and care of cultural heritage. And you'll be able to see some amazing examples of Marissa and Holly's painstaking work on display this evening. In particular, we have a lovely display of a portion of the leather shoes and boots that were rescued from the West Project excavations that Jamie has also worked on as well, but the conservators have really brought to life, and you can see their special packaging. You're very welcome to come up and take a close look and ask questions after the talk, but please don't touch. They've all been conserved, and although they look in great condition, they're very delicate, so please don't touch the objects. I also must acknowledge and thank Heritage Victoria as they've allowed us permission to bring the objects here this evening for you to look at. So this is who we are, and our two teams regularly work together across a wide variety of projects in Victoria. So just to recap, as archaeologists, which is Jamie, Ramona and myself, we work on site, we actually dig the things up, we actually pull them out of the ground, but then we have to manage them. As soon as you take an object out of the ground, you are very responsible for it, and usually once you've taken it out of those ground conditions, it's very unstable and very fragile, and it's likely to change and deteriorate over time. So that's when we obviously need the conservators. We often sometimes need them on site, and Holly will talk about that in her part of the talk today. Or even just a phone call to say, hey, I found this, I found some books in a tip deposit that are rapidly deteriorating. Please, Holly, how do we manage this on site today? And then basically everything comes back to our team in our office and our lab, and that's when it comes under the loader's leadership and with James' assistance to manage those objects, have a lot of detail and analyse them, and get all that material about dating, about past occupation of the site, who lived there, what kind of things they did there, what they ate, what they drank, what they wore. That's the information we get from those artefacts, which is amazing. We're fortunate in Victoria to have really strong heritage laws that require archaeological investigations of sites and the preservation of these high significance artefacts and materials that can be found in those sites. And that's thanks to the Heritage Act of 2017. Thanks to this Act, as well as its regulator, Heritage Victoria, we also have an important state archive where objects and artefacts of high significance are retained in a permanent collection for the heritage of the people of Victoria. And this is where the role of the object conservator is crucial in our process, is ensuring that these objects made of unstable materials like metal, wood, shell, iron and leather can be stabilised and treated so they'll be preserved for long-term storage in the state archive. So that gives you a bit of a précis about who we are and how we work together. And I'm going to hand you now to Mara to talk about the projects.
Okay, so this is the first part of our presentation, our two-part presentation. Sound as a barrel, historical archaeological conservation of a unique timber barrel on Little Lonsdale Street, Melbourne. The 274 to 278 Little Lonsdale Street site was included on the Victorian Heritage Inventory for its potential to contain historical archaeological remains associated with the colonisation and growth of early Melbourne. The nature of the proposed construction of a 31-storey residential hotel meant that the entirety of the site would be impacted. As such, archaeological investigation was required in accordance with the Heritage Act of 2017. In 2023, Brady Group commissioned Dr. Vincent Clark Archaeology and Heritage to conduct an archaeological excavation. This excavation uncovered significant structural remains and archaeological features, as well as more than 15,000 artefacts. These discoveries indicate a wide variety of historical activities, spanning from the mid-19th century when the wheelwright and blacksmith Edward Pope and his family resided at the location, to the Zevenberg brush factory which operated from the late 19th into the early 20th century. However, this presentation focuses on a distinct artefact associated with the initial period of historical occupation, from 1847 to 1850, during which Edward and Elizabeth Pope and their 3 young children inhabited the site. Edward and Elizabeth Pope arrived at Little Lonsdale Street in September of 1847, having immigrated 6 years earlier from England as assisted migrants. By 1851, the Pope family lived and worked from the premises, which by this time housed a blacksmith, wheelwright shop, yard, shed, house of 4 rooms and a kitchen. However, these weren't the first structures on the property. In January of 1851, Edward Pope was fined for the demolition and alteration of the building, which may have been a pre-existing structure or one he built and occupied himself. The precise location of the building he demolished remains uncertain. However, archaeological excavations exposed building stumps and a dense woody accumulation beneath the site-wide levelling fill and the remains of a stone forge, which historical records confirm was built in 1850. So you can see there, that's the stone forge. This woody accumulation was reported as Context 625 and was defined by a range of timber fragment sizes and shapes, including squared and rectangular sections, shavings, strips, fragments, and dowel-like cylindrical lengths, as well as larger sections of timber resembling panels or palings and thin strips of bark. So this is just a sample of what was a really dense deposit. So these images just show a very small amount of that woody accumulation that was collected. Although it's possible some of this material reflects woodworking activities linked to Pope's occupation as a wheelwright and blacksmith, the morphological characteristics of the timber fragments and the presence of bark strips are also compatible with elements of either a slab hut or workshop or a wattle and daub style cottage, both of which were common features of Melbourne's early streetscape. Notably, a wattle and daub cottage was actually documented in Little Lonsdale Street in 1841 near the intersection with King Street. So when considered alongside the historical and archaeological record, it's seems plausible that this woody accumulation in that last slide represents the debris of early structural remains demolished by Edward Poe. Alongside this woody accumulation, Context 625 was also artefact-rich, producing over 1,000 fragments, comprising domestic and personal items, faunal remains, and indications of leather work and metalwork. This is just a very small selection of the 15,000 artefacts collected, most of which were from this really early occupation deposit. Some of the artefacts pictured include this beautiful large hand-forged metal dish, clumps of horsehair, which were attached to textile and we think was possibly the remains of upholstery stuffing. A well-preserved length of knotted rope, which I personally love because I think it's so indicative of this, human action of coiling and knotting. Ceramic tableware, a metal child's plate with the alphabet to the rim. So that's a little child's plate there, which you can put the alphabet to the rim, a bit hard to see. And also children and adults' shoes. That's a little tiny child's shoes. Also an untrimmed leather calfskin that was possibly a blacksmith's apron, as is typical at the time, and the tapered iron nozzle of a blacksmith's belt, which is that little iron object up there. Animal bones also had hack marks, thanks to our fellow specialist Jared Paul, who's in the audience tonight, suggests they were butchered on site by an individual without the expertise or equipment of a professional butcher, perhaps signifying the portioning of meat by Edward's wife Elizabeth, whose immigration records identify her as a cook. These artefacts then form a material record of a brief period of occupancy between 1847 and 1850 by the Pope family, representing a significant research finding, highlighting the early development of Melbourne town during its formative years. During excavations, a deeply buried timber barrel was also exposed. The barrel was situated beneath the footprint of a later stone residence constructed by Edward Pope in 1855 and was set well below the base of the stone-lined pit attached to the rear of the dwelling. The barrel's position within the natural clay subsoil and beneath 11 clay dated to 1850 suggested it was associated with the timber dwelling remains and the artefact assemblage of Context 625. Consequently, the barrel was deemed significant both for its intrinsic value as an object and for its stratigraphic location within a highly significant archaeological context. The size, weight and fragility of the barrel, combined with the depth of the deposit, required quick thinking by the project archaeologists. And after consulting with Heritage Victoria to confirm the significance of the barrel and its probable accession into the state archive, the engaged conservator Dr. Holly Jones-Amin was called to attend the site. I'll now hand over to Holly.
So it's, as Michelle said, you get a call which you're not expecting that something needs stabilisation. It's, as Michelle said as well, when something comes out of the ground, it's really threatened to survive if it's an organic material. So I have a lifting kit, or I had a lifting kit, full of different things that I might need to help lift something. And I arrived on site with that kit. And I imagined that the barrel would need to be lifted piece by piece or stave by stave. I wasn't expecting it to be extant. I wasn't expecting it to be whole. And even if whole, I expected it to fall apart. And I've got lots of bandages. So plaster bandages, think archaeology shows, think dinosaurs, think a plaster cast around a leg. And that's what you typically do when you have something that needs stabilisation when you lift it. But I didn't need that because the barrel was actually reasonably structurally stable, but it was very soft. And so soft that if you held the top edge of the barrel, it would just break off in your fingers, like breaking a biscuit, super duperly soft. So I needed to excavate it gently to prevent damage and loss whilst in a very tight spot. And I did this with assistance from an archaeologist from Dr. Vincent Clark and Associates. So you can see a big paw squatting down in the central image. It's very tiny, so most of the time I was on my own. The clay deposit, the sediment, was very sticky, and it was a pretty cold morning. As you can see, I'm pretty rugged up. Pretty normal archaeology, Melbourne wet winter. So what I needed to do was I needed to separate from the back because Dr. Vincent Clark and Associate team had got the clay sediment from the front. I had to separate it from the back, which meant sort of reaching around and scraping with different tools. And once I had separated it from the sediment, we shuffled it forward. We we moved it forward. So I could put multiple layers of cling film wrap around it. So it's just food wrap, what you wrap your sandwiches in, which meant feeding it behind the barrel in an anti-clockwise manner with my left hand and passing it to my right in a narrow void behind the barrel. The cling film wrap had three purposes. It was to protect the soft wood surface. It was to hold the barrel together, literally like a bandage. It was acting as a bandage. It was to assist in preventing wood drying out. Because if it dries out, at this stage the wood will shrink, it will change shape, and the barrel will fall apart. So you needed to keep it damp as long as possible. So in the first image you can see Paul examining the barrel, Dr. Paul. And the wrap barrel was sound enough to place it in a jumbo construction bag in a heavy-duty polypropylene, it's a heavy-duty polypropylene containers which are designed to hold, transport and store gravel and construction debris. And archaeology and conservation are frequently borrowing from other industries because they have the right things that we need at the right time. And that Paul came up with all of that. When we lifted the barrel, we used Paul's A-frame pulley, which he'd devised for archaeological work in Egypt. And then we transported the barrel to Brimway Conservation Services, like the Cripps Institute in North Melbourne. So here you can see the barrel before cleaning. Marissa and I, plus an intern, reduced the sticky clay sediment mechanically and some fast-growing mould with the aid of plastic spatulas and microfiber cloths and ethanol. So you always want to use a tool that's softer than what you're working on, and I already said the wood was really soft, and that's why we're using plastic spatulas. Before we had permission and funds to commence interventive and time-consuming conservation, we kept the barrel in cold, cool, refrigerated storage at Heritage Victoria, and this was crucial to monitor its condition to prevent unreversible damage and keep mould at bay, so to stop the wood from drying out. I visited the barrel at Heritage Victoria frequently before we had the funds to do the conservation, to check its condition and to keep the mould colonies at bay. So here you can see a really different looking barrel. So here we've got the sediment, we've got the iron rings around it. Then here we have it clean in this image and ready to do the next stage of conservation. We've got rubber tyres wrapped around it to hold it together. And what you can see here, which is after removing the sediment, we can see black markings, which were uncovered on the base of the barrel, and Ramona's going to tell you what they think all of those mean. That was entirely their research. we uncovered it, but we by no means explored what they are. So after cleaning the barrel, it was immersed in different concentrations of something called polyethylene glycol for over 10 months. Now, polyethylene glycol is something you all use. If you look at the back of your shampoo bottle, you'll see something called PEG. It's a wax-like material, and what it does is it goes into the pores of the wood and it stops it from collapsing. We call it PEG for short. So it stabilises waterlogged archaeological wood by replacing internal water with a solid wax-like synthetic polymer. It prevents catastrophic shrinkage, warping and collapsing wood. It was used on the Mary Rose, so that medieval shipwreck of King Henry VIII. So it prevents collapse of the wood cells upon drying by strengthening the weakened structure and acting as a bulking agent. So the barrel was soaked in increasing concentrations of PEG. So here it is in its soaking, starting with from a low concentration and ending with a high concentration to ensure deep penetration. So once it no longer felt springy to the touch, the barrel was removed from the bath and it was air dried. And Marissa's now going to tell you about the next stages of treatment.
Thank you, Holly. I'm just going to talk about the treatment of the metal hoops that were on the barrel. So this is talking about the metal components. The 4 metal barrel hoops underwent controlled electrolytic reduction to remove active corrosion and soluble chloride ions or salts, and to render remaining corrosion products more stable. My colleague, Dr. Evan Tyndall, oversaw this particular process. Electrolysis was the principal technique used to treat the metal components. In practice, the process involves a low voltage direct current, which is passed through an alkaline ionic solution so that soluble chlorides, salts, are drawn away from the metal surface and active corrosion is chemically reduced. In the electrolytic cell, the artifact itself functions as a cathode, or the negatively charged electrode, while the sacrificial anode, the positively charged electrode, in this case we use graphite, completes this circuit. Negatively charged chloride ions migrate from the artifact towards the anode, and hydrogen evolution at the cathode assists the loosening and the detachment process of any adhered corrosion products. The bottom centre image, just this one here, is it really highlights this process quite nicely. The fizzing shown in the image is the electrical current completing a chemical reaction and transforming dissolved water into gas on the metal surface. This process required careful ongoing monitoring to avoid over-reduction of the metal, and parameters such as the current density and treatment duration were also closely monitored. Post-electrolysis, we applied tannic acid, followed by a protective coating of low-concentration paralloid B72 and microcrystalline wax, and this was to limit future ingress of moisture and oxygen. Tannic acid acts as a conversion-type treatment for iron. It reacts with ferric iron in the corrosion layers to form iron tannate complexes that are relatively insoluble. Now, this conversion reduces the mobility of iron corrosion products and helps passivate the metal surface by lowering the reactivity of any potential remaining iron compounds that might otherwise continue to corrode over time. Once stabilised, the two head hoops, which so these are the head hoops, one at the top and one towards the base of the barrel, and also the two central hoops, which are the quarter hoops, which are positioned here, were safely reintegrated back onto the barrel. The barrel is now conserved and in a stable state post treatment. I now pass on to Ramona.
So as a result of conservation, the timber of the barrel was identified as white oak and North American hardwood, historically used for shipbuilding and coopering, as the density and closed cellular structure make a suitable leak-proof and water-resistant wood. Conservation also revealed manufacturing techniques that allowed us to sort of identify it as having been wet-coopered, which means it was originally intended to be watertight and would have been used for transporting and storing liquids. The charred interior of the barrel, also revealed by conservation, suggests that it might originally have contained whiskey, rum, or brandy, as it was common to char the interior to enhance the flavour. So together with the wood species, we sort of presume it was likely imported from America or regional America. The marks revealed on the barrel head, there's a few different interpretations, but the most likely is that they are inspection or grading marks or codes that would have been applied by either the cooper, inspector, or shipper. For example, the S would represent spirits, while the P could stand for proof of cast or pure, and 8 for the batch or grade number. Alternatively, they could be the initials of the importer or consignee, provoking a question of whether it's possible the suffix P is still for code. While dry coopered casks, which were used for storing flour and dry goods, were an early throwaway technology, wet coopered casks were valuable and multi-purpose. And in the early and mid-19th century, and even into the latter part of the 19th century, were often washed out and reused, which, based on the stratigraphic location, was undoubtedly the case with the barrel we excavated. So what was it reused for? It's possible it was a slack tub or trough, tank, which was often a repurposed barrel that was used by blacksmiths for filling with water, for cooling and quenching tools and small workpieces. However, the topography of the site, being near Elizabeth Street, was marked by recurrent flooding, and the timeframe associated with the burial of the barrel predates the introduction of piped water to Melbourne in 1857. It then seems possible, and perhaps more likely, that the barrel was repurposed for early water management or collection. Perhaps it served as a cistern or sump to gather and retain rainwater for distribution to the residential area or the workshop. Or it was incorporated into informal infrastructure to channel collected water for use in the blacksmith shop. While the specific purpose for which the watertight barrel was deliberately repurposed remains unclear, it prompts reflection on the opportunistic, adaptive, and innovative technologies and practices utilised by early colonisers, resonating with the characteristics of that Context 625 assemblage. This presentation has demonstrated the outcomes of professional conservation interventions on site, followed by comprehensive and professional conservation treatment. These procedures not only guarantee the physical preservation of a unique artefact like the barrel for future research and display, but enriched the artefact analysis and contributed additional details to substantiate the object's significance. The conservators' approach to material analysis, which contrasts a little bit with some of the archaeological approaches, revealed new details and provided complementary perspectives for subsequent research. These results deepened our comprehension of the barrel's historical provenance and archaeological importance as an object that enhances our understanding of the environmental conditions and availability of resources encountered by the site's historical occupants and the material strategies they might have employed in response. Thank you. I'll now go back to Michelle, who will introduce the second section of our presentation.
Thanks, Rhona. So that was our first case study. Our second case study also highlights those similar integrations and collaborations between conservators and archaeologists, but also probably highlights how important it is to have your client also being part of that collaborative process, as well as the regulator, which is Heritage Victoria. So from 2018 until present day, the CPB, John Holland joint venture had engaged Archaeology and Heritage, as well as the Prahran Conservation Services at the University of Melbourne, to provide archaeological conservation services and management for 8 archaeological sites that were within the West Gate Tunnel project area. And I want to talk today the case study from that project that I want to talk about is related to 2 of those historical archaeological sites. One of them is the North Melbourne Depot site, which we actually spoke about, Jared and I spoke about that site last year. And that's this red outline that you can see here. It's quite a large site, and it's located right near Footscray Road. That's Melbourne Creek. But you can see the Melbourne Rail Yards extend along here, and then you've got Spencer Street there, and basically West Melbourne and North Melbourne sitting over here. And the second site is a small historical archaeological site known as the Melbourne Rail Yard Artefact deposit, because it was only recently discovered through the West Gate Tunnel project works. So the North Melbourne Locomotive Depot shed was built in 1888 and was once the main Victorian Railways maintenance depot for coal-powered steam engines. The depot shed was once the largest building in the Southern Hemisphere, at over 200 metres long and 80 metres wide, and it was a major place of employment in Melbourne from 1888 until 1964, when it was demolished, and a new South Island station train maintenance facility was set up to make way for diesel-powered engines. So it's a significant site in itself with major structural remains that were managed and uncovered during West Gate Tunnel, and if you missed my talk last year, you'll have to look it up on the PMI YouTube channel. But we found a significant artefact deposit that was uncovered by accident during excavations for the West Gate Tunnel project in December 2020. And you can see these yellow dots here mark the location of those excavations where we found a significant artefact deposit, which was a dense concentration of 19th-century artefacts that were present below layers of rail ballasting fill below the groundwater table. So very unexpected and quite unusual. And this deposit was not previously known before this was found. The deposit was found beneath 1.5 to 2 metres of fill and rail ballast, so it's quite unexpected. The second site, as I said, was discovered out of the West Gate Tunnel project works, and it's located, as you can see, it's underneath Diamond Road Bridge, and basically where that connects with an elevated road that's known as the West Gate Tunnel Road. That is part of the very active part of the current rail yard at the moment, and it will be run onwards. So these 2 deposits we want to talk about together because they both are significant artefact deposits, and the deposits are very similar in their character, their stratigraphy, and their composition, and they're very unexpected. And it was only through some background research that we kind of understood why they're there and what they might mean. So they both have a similar character, being refuse deposits that were laid down in what was the former West Melbourne Swamp. So this is an 1864 Cox nautical map of Melbourne. I will just an excerpt from it, and you can see this is West Melbourne here, this is North Melbourne, and that is Darwin Road. It's known as Swamp Road back then. And you can see the very early railway lines built on a causeway through what was the former wetland and marsh area. And this was the former lagoon, or Blue Lake, as it was known, and it was in its heyday, and before we filled it with rubbish and put toxic waste into it. It was basically a very key marshy wetland that was an important place for Aboriginal people during the before contact period. Basically, the result of landfilling practices occurred in the 1870s and 1880s with the Victorian government as part of. It was very prone to flooding. I could probably talk about this for an hour, so I will try to keep it very tight, but it was very prone to flooding this entire area, and it obviously became used for cattle grazing and then dumping of material into private research. We think the artefact deposits were placed there for one of two reasons. One of which could have been illicit rubbish dumping. There was no formal management of waste practices in the city of Melbourne until the late 1880s, and so it could have just been that people were bringing their rubbish from homes and commercial properties in North Melbourne, down the hill, down the road, just dumping it in the ground, and that's probably one awful action. The other thing was that the Low-Lying Lands Commission, created by the government, instigated this major redevelopment scheme to drain the swamp and reclaim the land by landfill rubbish dumping of municipal waste from the city of Melbourne, as well as waste from Victorian Railways and the Harbour Trust. And the idea was also to drain the infill with material that was spoil material created from the cutting of the food canal, the railway coal canal, and the concrete. So it was a very major land modification event that happened in West Melbourne in the 1870s and 1880s. So that gives us a bit of a history as to why we've got these deep and significant artefact deposits in these locations. So the artefact deposits themselves are quite interesting, as I already mentioned, that they were laid down in a similar time period between the 1860s to 1890s, prior to the creation of the rail yards. They're intact, deep and well preserved refuse deposits that contain domestic and commercial refuse, probably from, as I said, there's a variety of sources from North Melbourne, West Melbourne inhabitants and businesses, but also City of Melbourne, or it also could be a Harbour Trust or Victorian Railways. However, most of the material that we see is much more associated with commercial or domestic waste. So we don't see much of that more commercial or industrial waste from Harbour Trust or Railways. So that's what they're just saying to us anyway, by its character. The deposit was capped by the rail yard formation, and the artefact deposits are found at the top level between 2 and 4 metres below the current ground level, and they extend as deep as 8 metres in depth. But we do not know how wide or extensive that deposit is. It could potentially be under the entire rail yard. We don't know. We've only got our little windows through these interventions that have had to happen through major construction works. Also, what's characteristic is the artefacts are pretty well preserved. You can obviously see there are a lot of fragments, but there are a lot of larger fragments. There's also whole bodies and near complete things. And because it was a wet deposit found under the water table, you have very good preservation of organic materials. And that includes the leathers, which is the subject of our talk today. So you can see here a selection of Jamie's wonderful artefact photos to just give you a context of the type of other materials that were found a lot in the boots and shoes in this deposit. But what is unusual is to find more than 200 well-preserved boots and shoes that are identifiable and are able to be studied and analysed in this one type of deposit source, and that it's so well preserved as well as all of this other material culture from that period. So I'll just give you a quick look at some photos of what it looked like coming out of the ground, because that's always fun, isn't it? So this is the Melbourne Rail Yard site. So they had to install new solid piers to support the elevated roadway, and that was done using these 1 metre wide mechanical augers. And you can see that as the auger turns, this material, the soil comes up from below. And actually what's in that dark material, because it's quite grey, whereas the soil around is a bit more brownish. That dark grey is pretty distinctive for us as archaeologists. It shows us this is organic material that's been degraded. It's likely an archaeological deposit. And this is what the artefacts look like when they first come out. They're pretty messy, they're pretty gross, they're pretty slimy. Basically what happened was the material was taken out of the ground. The Westgate Tunnel Project environment team immediately noticed this stuff coming out. We went on the site, they then followed their own defined procedure that's been put in place under the heritage consents that need to be applied for to do work in the heritage sites. And the project didn't, I'm running ahead of myself, the project didn't know this was an archaeological site at the time, so there were no archaeologists on site, but they immediately followed their protocols of unexpected discoveries, and we were called out and assessed it. They then started stockpiling material in safer places away from the live rail, and then we came on site and we actually sorted that material by hand and collected artefacts. And you can see examples here. This is one of the shoes or boots. There's another one here. They look like they're pretty slimy. That's a close-up as well of one of the boots. You kind of see a little eyelet in the shape of the outside of the boot. They look pretty gross, right? And you usually have to go by feel and sorting through that spoil and collecting it. I can see Jared nodding because he sorted through a lot of this material. This is the second location, the North Melbourne location site where we found material. The conditions there wasn't live rail, it was a bit less stressful. It was still a full construction zone and they did need to get on with construction work though, so there is pressure on site. But again, it was unexpected. They were doing what's called a non-destructive digging, NDD excavation with a vacuum truck. This is quite a big irregular shaped hole. They were looking for services they thought should be there and they had to keep looking so the hole got bigger. And as the hole got bigger, they then exposed this, the top of this artefact-rich deposit. So that's looking directly down on top of the deposit. And the only reason you can see it clearly is that the muddy waters are being sucked out by that vacuum truck as they're going. So later we had to come back and had to actually do a bigger excavation because they found concrete and ground and had to remove that. So we actually got a better look at the deposit in section. So this is the deposit down here. You can see it's the kind of lumpy, crumbly looking stuff at the bottom. And these are layers of clay fill and rail ballast that were lying above it. So it's only at about 1.5 metres in this particular location, but in the Melbourne Rail Yard, the artefact deposit is as deep as something is 3 or 4 metres. So the top of the deposit does vary across that area of what was formerly the West Melbourne Swamp. You can see some examples there of artefacts that were pulled out of the ground on the site. So we pull those things out of the ground, we have to triage them quite quickly, and as I said before, we have to call the conservators to say, well, hang on, we're pulling out organic material from wet deposits. The day that I was there, it was a really hot day. I'm aware I've got leather coming out of the ground and it's wet. I've got to get that in plastic bags and I've got to get it cooled really quickly because it could be great. So the next stage of the process kind of ends up back in Ramona's hands. So I'm going to let Ramona take over now and talk to you about those next stages.
So as Michelle mentioned, a total of 224 19th century shoes and boots were collected, with 162 from the Melbourne Rail Yard and 62 from the North Melbourne Locomotive Depot. Despite being covered in sediment, it was evident most shoes were nearly intact and materially composite, not only comprising leather, but components made from wood, metal and fabric. The interpretive value and research potential of this substantial collection of well-preserved and varied footwear indicated the prospective significance of these artefacts, while the capped nature of the archaeological deposits Michelle mentioned suggested a date range for the shoes that further increased their significance. However, once removed from the anaerobic conditions, they are highly susceptible to deterioration, and any shoes retained for accessioning into the state archive would likely require conservation treatment, which posed a distinct challenge for post-excavation artefact management. And by that, I mean what do we do when 224 wet, muddy leather shoes are brought back to your lab? Retaining and subsequently conserving all 224 shoes was neither practical, economically defensible, nor essential. It was therefore crucial to devise an appropriate sampling strategy. The primary aim was then to develop a comprehensive understanding of the individual shoes within each assemblage, treating them as distinct collections while also considering them in relation to each other, given their geographic and chronological proximity. Consultation was undertaken with the engaged conservators, Holly and Marisa to determine how our historical artefact team can safely conduct preliminary cleaning that will allow for more detailed assessments without compromising the material integrity of the objects. The conservators recommended particular brushes, appropriate support to be positioned in and around the shoes during cleaning, and straightforward, gentle cleaning methods that didn't necessitate the specialised skills of a conservator. A dedicated workspace was established, a bench, air purifier, recommended tools, and tripod-mounted camera. Our historical artefact assistant, James Houston, was then tasked with undertaking the preliminary cleaning and documentation of the complete shoe assemblages, which she did brilliantly. This just gives you a little bit of an idea of the volume and also the results of Jamie's very careful preliminary cleaning. Each shoe underwent individual cleaning according to the conservator's recommendations, received an accession number as required by Heritage Victoria's guidelines, and was photographed by Jamie in high resolution from various angles. So these are the sort of process photos that supported Jamie collecting that data required for detailed cataloguing. Jamie also used shorthand physical recording sheets that were later transcribed into a digital artefact catalogue. This process facilitated a concentrated and efficient documentation in a suitable workspace, eliminating the need to switch between a clean computer and a contaminated laboratory. The preliminary cleaning, photographic documentation recording also constituted a cost-effective yet high-value data initiative that our archaeology team could safely perform before the more expensive professional conservation. This approach also guaranteed that any shoes that might ultimately be discarded were meticulously documented beforehand. It ensured the sampling strategy was well informed by the typological features observable within each shoe assemblage. So while Jamie was doing this, she's sort of looking for, what shoes have textile elements, markings, fastenings, is there evidence for repair or use wear, what are the distinct styles, and how does each shoe differ from other candidates selected for retention to ensure that the overall sample forms a sufficient representation of the complete shoe assemblages. So it is quite an undertaking. Consultation with Heritage Victoria was then undertaken to further refine the sampling strategy. And as a result, 37 of the 244 shoes excavated were proposed for conservation and now ready for assessment by the engaged conservators. In an uncommon but highly beneficial initiative, clients and stakeholders, including the Textile Project in Transurban, were invited to our artefact lab to examine the physical collection, interact with the objects, and consult directly with our archaeologists and object conservators as they conducted their conservation assessment. This invitation was met with enthusiasm by 8 client and stakeholder participants. I'll now hand back to Holly and Marisa, who will talk very briefly about the treatment.
So we got the pleasure of meeting the clients, but also persuading the clients what conservation is, what we needed to do, and familiarise them with the time it takes to do conservation. So what we did was Marisa and I were there with Ramona and Michelle and Jamie, and we had all the shoes out in front of us. But what we did first is we went through a PowerPoint. And the PowerPoint was to give them an idea, what is conservation? What's the different stages of conservation? How long does it take? And you can see different slides here that show different things. What do we need to do? The code of ethics that we work by. In Australia, we belong to a group called the Australian Institute of Conservation of Cultural Materials. What first aid is, which is the first stage of conservation, which Jamie was also doing when she was working on the shoes, and the different types of materials you might encounter. Yeah. What to lift, how to lift something, and the different tools that Jamie was going to use. We also talked through artefact conservation proposal, and that proposal is something that is in the Heritage Act that has to be approved by Heritage Victoria, and the client has to agree to pay for the conservation. So I've got this here, the artefact conservation proposal. And by doing this, we gave the client an idea of what the role the conservator has or what we do. We talked about the proposal and what was likely to happen. We talked about the types of interventions, the type of conservation treatment steps might be required. And what Marisa and I did together with the client and with the shoes is we discussed treatment steps and we removed some of the shoes because they might be either beyond conservation They did not require conservation because they were stable enough and Jamie had done a lot of work already, or they weren't significant enough. So when things are approved for conservation, they have to be of high significance or they have to be really unusual, and some things were less unusual than others. So this process assisted in the artefact conservation proposal being accepted and treatment commencing. I have to say, you know, Ramona and Michelle were doing a lot of work to engage the clients and convince them as well, because there's this really long stage between excavation and conservation. And in that stage, somebody has to manage how it's looked after. You heard me talk before about the barrel, and you've heard Michelle talk about refrigeration and keeping things cool. These objects will degrade, and they degrade more and more, even if they're in the refrigerator, if they aren't conserved. So these guys have an excellent process in getting that treatment happening quickly enough to reduce the amount of deterioration that occurs. So I'll now hand over to Jamie, is it? No? Marissa, sorry, Marissa. That's a new one. This is Marissa's handiwork. I was going to say too, these are now very expensive shoes. So if you think about the amount of time excavating, think about Jamie wearing John, you think about Marissa, think, I don't know, 10 pairs of Gucci or something.
So I'll talk briefly about the conservation treatment process for these shoes, and this was following the beautiful work that Jamie did cleaning the shoes. So the leather shoes and other artefacts were transferred to our labs for conservation treatment. Most of the leather assemblage had been excavated, as Michelle and Ramona had said, in a damp or non-dry state, and were therefore held in cool storage prior to treatment to avoid irreversible shrinkage and embrittlement that can be the result from uncontrolled drying. Wet archaeological leather requires maintained dampness after excavation, which is achieved by cold storage. A small number of already dry leather finds were kept in climate-controlled storage and did not require refrigeration. Any signs of localized mold growth, which can occur on wet and damp archaeological leather, was addressed and treated in accordance with our institutional protocols, using a combination of both targeted surface cleaning and the application of a 70 to 30% alcohol deionized water mixture. Our conservation team then proceeded with controlled drying, designed to limit both dimensional stress and minimize distortion. Controlled drying involved blocking and soft strapping materials. Strapping materials, such as cotton tape, which is shown in the image, to support and hold the artefact's original forms as safely as possible. This work was both labour-intensive and meticulous. Compressed or swashed shoes were gently reshaped in incremental stages during the drying cycle, as far as the leather's flexibility and their condition allowed. All reshaping and interventions were documented to support future interpretation and a clear conservation history. Cleaning involved a combination of both controlled dry techniques and wet leather carefully managed wet cleaning. Minimal wet cleaning involved gently rinsing adhering sediment with small amounts of deionized water and soft brushes. More fragile, friable, or non-diagnostic pieces of leather that could be damaged by mechanical action were supported on fine mesh trays and cleaned ultrasonically at very low settings. Residual sediment and compressions, particularly around metal fastenings like eyelets, were cleaned under magnification with small dental tools and scalpels to avoid damaging or scratching the surface. After cleaning, friable or delaminated leather was stabilized locally with a conservation-grade consolidator to areas requiring mechanical support. Metal components were degreased with acetone, stabilized according to their condition, and finished with a compatible protective coating. Detached or unstable elements at risk of loss were sympathetically reintegrated using toned Japanese kozo paper as a vacuum to reinforce and support joins, and reversible wheat starch paste was selected to secure the paper repairs in place. Now, kozo paper is from the mulberry plant, and it is a strong yet lightweight paper and can be toned to reduce visual impact. And wheat starch paste is a very chemically stable, reversible adhesive with both good aging properties and strength. Together, they provided us with discrete reversible mechanical support suited to conservation methods. Through this careful program of cleaning, drying, stabilisation and repair, the shoes are now in a much more stable state, albeit still delicate, and it will support future research, display and education. I'll pass along to Jamie to talk more about her research and insight into the shoes.
Thanks, Marisa. So, up first, we have a Balmoral boot with a 20mm stacked leather heel. It was likely made using a combination of Mackay sewing machine and hand-hammered nailing. The Mackay sewing machine was first patented in 1858 and was one of the first sewing machines designed specifically for shoes. It was used to sew the upper and sole layers together quickly and easily. This boot was made for the right foot using a crooked last, which produced pairs of shoes with a distinct right and left. The manufacture of shoes tailored to fit different feet became prevalent by about 1860, but prior to this, shoes were crafted on a straight last, with differentiation between left and right shoe occurring only through consistent wear by the user or owner. This detail, along with evidence for use of the Mackay sewing machine, indicates that this shoe postdates 1860. This boot has no surviving means of closure. However, conservation treatment revealed small puckers along the front edge of the left quarter and frayed stitching on the seam of the right, which suggests that the shoe once featured buttons and a button placket, which would have been this gap here. This placket would have contained buttonholes, and the boot in its original condition would likely have resembled the pair in the historical photograph on the left here. And button boots were extremely popular in the late 19th century among women and girls of all ages, as was the scroll top detail, which is the sort of swoop shape of the top here. These features suggest that boots like this were both fashionable and able to transition the wearer from girl to woman. It is thus fitting that this style, combined with the 230mm sole length, make it reasonable to conclude that this Balmoral was worn by a girl aged 10 to 13 years. Notably, we also have hobnails on the heels of this boot, which are sort of this green hobnails there. Hobnails are large-headed and short-shanked nails that were hammered into the heel and sole of the shoe to improve traction on wet or muddy ground, and are common on 19th century military, labourers and mountaineers' footwear. At first, the presence of hobnails on a young girl's boots appeared somewhat strange. However, a thorough comparative analysis of historical photographs revealed that hobnailed soles were very common for 19th century Victorian school-aged children, regardless of gender. As you can see by this example of a girl about 10 years old, and she has hobnails on her soles. This trend may have been due to specific environmental conditions like muddy terrain or unmade ground, or it could have been intended to prolong the lifespan across these shoes. Because with daily use, leather soles were known to wear through in only a couple of months, so it was not surprising to find that this boot also has evidence of original repair. The sole features the remains of a patch attached with copper nails that extends from waist to toe. So that's from here all the way up to the toe here. And this is an historical repair technique appropriate to half soling, and was often accompanied by heeling, which is H-E-E-L-I-N-G, in which new layers were added to the heel to level it out after being worn down. Instead of heeling this boot, it appears that the cobbler, the wearer, or the parent elected to hobnail the heel instead, perhaps to extend the time between repairs or preserve the heel until she had outgrown her Balmorals. Up next is a broken style boot with a 25mm stacked leather heel, 4 lacing eyelets on each quarter and hobnailing on the sole. It was manufactured using pegging and nailing, and the hobnails were hand-applied. Pegging and nailing are similar, though where shoe nails are typically made of copper or iron, shoe pegs are made from wood. The pegs have a square cross-section and often appear, as they do on the sole waist of our brogan, in 2 close rows tightly together, so that's what kind of visible on this part here. Like the previous Balmoral, this brogan was crafted using a crooked last and was meant to fit the right foot. At 280mm in length, it was likely worn by an adult man. Brogans are defined by straightforward construction and were typically made from just 2 or 3 pieces of leather. They are also one of the few historical styles that generally includes a tongue, often referred to as an excluder for its ability to keep debris out of the shoe. Though brogans were often closed with buckles, conservation revealed the remains of metal eyelets, meaning that this boot was closed with laces. These could be made of braided cotton, similar to what we have today, or more likely of very thin strips of leather. As on the Balmoral, this brogan was hobnailed, which warranted another comparative visual analysis using historical images. The hobnail pattern on the sole of the boot was found to clearly match examples of both children's footwear and adult mountaineering boots, and suggests that particular patterns were preferred and replicated for the position of hobnails on the shoe sole. The clearest examples I could find that match our brogan are the 2 historical photographs on the right here of this young boy. You can very clearly see the pattern there. And this mountaineer's boots have pretty much an identical pattern as well. Research also indicated that although boots and shoes could be purchased already hobnailed, as shown in this advertisement here, in which they're pre-done, catalogues also advertise the sale of hobnails alone, suggesting that the wearer, or indeed their parents, could apply them themselves. And our last example is a slipper made of soft leather and features an elasticated panel over the top of the foot. That is sort of this area which we suspect would have been completely filled in with the elasticated thread. Elastic drawers and shoes were first popularised by the Congress-style boots of the late 1830s, which were characterised by elastic fabric sewn into cutouts on either side of the ankle, which is very similar to a modern Blundstone or Chelsea boot. It is alleged that the first of these boots were made for Queen Victoria to demonstrate the marvels of elasticated fabric, which is a very recent invention at the time. In the latter part of the 19th century, elastic was frequently employed in a variety of house slipper styles, which have become fashionable Victorian-era footwear for the home. This example features a rounded, partially preserved gore of elastic thread over the top of the foot. Now, an identical period photograph could not be found. However, I was able to source the catalogue advertisement here, which is from actually an Australian catalogue, which is a pretty close match. And this may be due to this particular style not being as popular as the 2 styles we have here. In this historical photograph, you can see the triangular gauze instead there, and on these extant examples, you sort of have the zigzag ball pattern there, all filled in with the elasticated panels. As was the case for the Balmoral and Brogan, the slipper was also made for the right foot using a crooked last, and therefore likely postdates 1860. It also appears to have been made using a case sewing machine in combination with hand-hammered iron nails in the heel and wooden pegs on the edges of the outsole. A combination of manufacturing techniques is very common among the examples I catalogued and could be owing to many factors, be they repairs, modifications, or reinforcements made throughout the lifetime of the shoe. At 270 millimetres in length, the slipper was presumably worn by an adult man, though house slippers of this style were worn by any gender and all ages, being one of the few styles fit for the whole family. And I hand it back to you, Miranda, please.
The results Jamie's just presented indicate that conservation treatment uncovers additional insights within the shoe assemblages, clarifying presumed manufacturing techniques, materials, and assisting in the identification of probable production periods that may otherwise remain undiscovered. This knowledge enhances our understanding of the site and the interpretation of the artefact assemblages, which can be integrated into and elevate the quality of comprehensive archaeological reports prepared for each site. Furthermore, the effective management of these assemblages ensure that despite the substantial volume of artefacts, the legislative requirements are effectively met, and what resulted was a publicly accessible reference collection that encompasses both detailed illustrated digital records and representative physical examples of artefacts. As a case study, these results underscore the iterative nature and adaptive strategies necessary for effective archaeological project and artefact management, which depend on multi-stakeholder consultation and collaboration between a range of specialists and professionals. In summary, the successful implementation of unexpected finds protocols alongside continuous collaboration and consultation between archaeologists, artefact specialists, clients, conservators, and heritage regulators, both on-site and after excavation, ultimately resulted in a significant collection of 37 unique 19th century shoes that will be accessioned into the Victorian State Archive. Thanks so much for your time tonight.
I just wanted to thank you all for your attention, but also to thank Lauren and Aaron and all the team at the PMI Australian History Library for having us this evening. And I want to thank my colleagues for coming along tonight and giving up their time to speak to everyone. And we're happy to take any questions that you might have. Yes.
I have a general question for everybody. It's given that shoes were not something like we would throw away today, and they were quite an expensive item, they were handed down in the family. Is there anything that indicated within the find to suggest why so many valuable items like this were all thrown away together?
So this is something that Jamie and I have discussed a lot. Obviously, we're sort of at the point now in the research and the project where the shoes have been conserved, they've come back to us, and what we now do is we go back into those artefact catalogues, we enter in the new information that's been revealed through conservation, and we sort of do further research. So one of the questions that we have at the moment is that despite having 324 shoes, we haven't identified a pair yet. So that in itself raises, I mean, it potentially raises more questions than answers. But it's really sort of challenging our interpretation of the site. So it's possible that they were collected from a particular area, perhaps like an institution or a suburb as a part of some sort of carts of rubbish that came in and was sorted into material categories and dumped together. It's also possible, as Michelle suggested, it's opportunistic dumping. We did wonder whether they might have been sort of samples that were retained by a cobbler or someone who was doing repairs, because also it was actually common in the 19th century to say, because shoes were expensive, that if one of them wore out, you wouldn't throw both shoes out, you would have one repaired. So that's another possibility, that these were sort of samples kept in order to replicate the one that was beyond repair, because they do also show signs of pretty substantial use for most of them. For anything that you would add to that, Jamie?
Yeah, it's pretty clear that pretty much all of them have been worn. And it was also not uncommon for cobblers to salvage parts of shoes to repair other shoes, so as not to cut into a brand new piece of leather, sort of take pieces from what you've already got. So it wouldn't surprise me if that cobbler had kept a massive board just as to make sure when they were around. As to why none of them repairs, I don't know.
In another area of the swamp on the other side of Lincoln's Creek, for the same project, we actually uncovered another huge refuse deposit, and it actually had a very identifiable assemblage of material that must have come from an old cobbler shop. There was offcuts of leather, there were some of the shoe lasts as well, like we had tools, and we had similar, we might only have one shoe, or lots and lots of soles, so heaps of soles. So I think that was quite a bit more identifiable, whereas this assemblage, it's a bit more unusual. So
You see parts around it.
we're
So
missing something there.
it's a discrete area, so you always feel a bit cheated because you can't tell what's around that discrete area. But it's a good question. Yes.
Stay tuned.
And sorry, the gentleman in red. Yeah.
Just wondering whether it's possible to identify what wood barrels DNA or whether it's local wood in particular.
Yes, so through a little sample was taken from the time as a part of the conservation treatment, and it was sent to the Greenway, and they then sort of also worked with a timber specialist who did some sort of microscopic testing, and it was revealed to be white oak, so it's a North American species. So that sort of assisted us in considering a little bit more of, the historical and geographic provenance of the barrel. It's also helped us to, confirm that it was a wet cooper barrel, because that type of construction only used white oak because it was considered to be a higher quality and to be, more watertight, so more suited to liquid barrels.
Anyone else? Any questions?
Ask another one. There's a question from Marissa. I noticed with the barrel, you actually had to remove the metal rings.
Yes.
One, did they come out easily at the top off? Were they difficult to get out? Was there any damage?
That was myself and my colleague Evan, and we removed a lot of those concretions that were on the surface of the barrel hoops. And once that was removed, that came off quite easily, and there was no damage to the underlying timber. And actually left the indication of where they were, so we're able to reintegrate it as closely as possible back into the correct alignment. And the reason why it wasn't separated is because ideally with a peg treatment, having metal in contact with that solution is not ideal because it has potential to corrode, which is why, as Holly mentioned, we use those light tubes to isolate the metal and make sure that wasn't in contact with the peg. And that process of mechanically removing that corrosion really assisted us to separate the quite easily, and we're able to then effectively treat the metal and put it in that electrolysis treatment where we could actually target and ensure that the chlorides were addressed as well.
Got one thing to add is that the wood shrunk slightly. So it's not as big as it used to be. So they were very plumped out with water. And the peg treatment, they're slightly shrunk. So the iron rings were tightly on it, and then the wood shrunk down. So when they went back on after, you had to fill in some gaps, didn't you, in some places between the iron.
It ended up actually being a very small area that we had to, there was a small gap, you may have seen in one of the earlier photos, there was a slight gap between the staves. Once we add post-treatment and we undertook some separation to the timber, we're able to get it quite closely aligned where it dropped only slightly, and it actually is quite tight and it holds its shape really nicely. So there are no gaps anymore, and we did a very small balsa wood fill, which is probably about 2 or 3 mils, just at the very bottom, because the staves themselves are quite unique and hand-sawn. Some are wider than others, and that was for the construction. So there was naturally some gaps in there, so we were able to tighten that up. And the hoops actually sit quite closely to the original location, which is great.
Is the barrel on display anywhere?
Still at the conservation lab, but will be returned to Ramona and the team.
So yeah, it's one of the main reasons that the barrel, was conserved is that it is a unique object from that period. So, it's so close to intact and complete. So Heritage Victoria was particularly interested in that, not only for future research but display purposes. So that would go into the Heritage Victoria artefact repository, and it will most likely then be used for future museum displays or exhibitions or things like that. So it definitely has a display future.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for this fabulous talk. Before you found the barrel and like sitting down through whatever maze or whatever, can you explain what you found on the outside and on the inside? And did you make a distinction? So if you find a ring or something at the top, did you then think, oh my goodness, there might be a big other artifacts inside that?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because it was incredibly low down. And so to that point, we've been excavating these sort of remains of this stone-lined pitch that was attached to the back of the dwelling. It was built in 1866. But, and everyone sort of, you'll immediately think, oh, perhaps it was a cesspit, a barrel cesspit. But it was actually, it was way below those sort of remains. We don't actually even think that that stone-lined pit was a cesspit. There was also no cess-like contents within the barrel. It was incredibly muddy. It was this really thick, muddy clay. It was sort of really encased in the subsoil. So we were sort of really just doing, what is required and appropriate to kind of reveal the stratigraphy associated with those structural remains. And then I think it was at one point it was sort of the very top of the barrel head was sort of revealed, and then going, well, hang on, what's that? We didn't expect to find an artifact so low down. Then, of course, we did approach it like it might have been a cesspit, so we were sort of also excavating very carefully. and looking at potential contents, but it was just filled with this thick mud and encased in this thick mud. So yeah, we just carefully continued to excavate it, but also when we sort of realised how intact it was, we realised it was something quite unique.
And it had a bottom with no top.
Correct. Yeah, exactly.
It was also probably an indication of its previous function.
Yeah.
It was for storage of something. Whether it was refuse deposits or cess, but it was quite clean and it looked like it had been cleaned out.
Yeah, we think I think as well, it's just really interesting because, you know, where it was positioned, it did raise a lot of questions, but there is sort of some evidence for, I guess, sort of ad hoc, informal kind of infrastructure being built around that time period to try and direct water to certain places. I mean, that's probably one possibility.
Like you said, it had gotten flooded quite a lot.
That area flooded a lot, yeah. So it was around Business Street, which, you know, was flooding all the time. Yeah, so it was, those are one of those topographic modifications that you read about in Melbourne with those clay filling events. They were sort of to, you know, remediate that flooding. So we think that this might sort of be, I suppose, a similar time period where not only were people trying to mitigate flooding out of ground, but how can we also work with this method we've made? Yeah.
So it might have been like a drainage feature, like too close, say water runoff from the roof or something like that, potentially. We were hoping it had a whole cache of artifacts in the bottom, but it had clearly been cleaned out at some point and backfilled. And a feature like that, we call it an intrusive feature because it's dug into the ground and set in. And we normally dig the intrusive feature first, but in this case, because we had this timber, we had to actually do the reverse and excavate the outside first very carefully to fully expose and very carefully dig the interior as we went, and we really had to have the conservators on site and their guidance to assist with that because it's such a delicate project. But it was so well preserved, which is really unusual.
And we did fully empty it prior to its removal, so we were in there with shovels and everything, putting it out, searching for this cache of contents. Unfortunately, it was just a very gravelly, muddy, clay sort of substance, which is unfortunate, but we got the barrel out of it too.
And I didn't have to empty it.
No, I did.
And presumably that A-frame is actually like a triangle.
Yeah, it's a hoist,
Hook it up, yeah, it was
So
a very
chains.
difficult position. Yeah, it was sort of a little bit underneath the wall of the old factory, which was abutting the street.
It was actually partially under the street.
Yeah.
Half the barrel was under the
Yeah.
street. So when I'm getting my hands under,
Yeah,
I'm
when
under
we
the
were
street.
digging it out, we're sort of hugging the barrel, trying to get the way around to the side.
It couldn't have been more.
No.
It wasn't.
I think it started raining, didn't it? It was
Yeah, it
raining
was
that day.
raining.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, this fall, there was showing up there, we set up a tarp for us so we could continue working. It was great,
But he was a complete pro the way he put the A-frame up.
yes,
Because there was hardly any spots to put it on at all.
yeah, and it was, it had to be carried out by about 6 of us carrying that big bag, but it was just so waterlogged and physically massive that it was very difficult to move, but we were lucky to get it out.
Thank you so much for the question.
Yeah, the gentleman at the back, sorry, have a question?
Oh, yes, I do, yeah.
Yeah.
Could you explain something about the state pathway reference on the slide? Is that some sort of special heritage state pathway? Where is it?
So Heritage Victoria, they actually have an archive that belongs to the state. That is where when we talk about retaining artefacts and accessioning them, they go to Heritage Victoria's archive. So it's physical space that's climate controlled, but it also ensures that these artefacts are accessible for future research, can be used by different museums, and so they're all managed according to legislation and by professional curators.
Sorry, where is it?
There's one part of it, is in Oxford, and there's another area in Denmark that's private space.
Can you give me any idea of the holdings that they have? Is it expensive?
It's very expensive. Yeah. It's very expensive. Yeah, very
How
high
does the researcher find out what's in there to know how to get
You
it?
can just contact Heritage Victoria. They have a very extensive catalogue, it's database, it's digital. And you can just write to them and explain your purpose, your research reasons, and usually they make it quite available, particularly for students and researchers. So you can just go to the archaeology or archaeology admin email address. It's on Heritage Victoria's website for archaeology. We're happy to help you out in your contact.
And that it boasts having the best 19th century collection in the world because of the laws here and because the way they've worked out what's significant and what's not significant. But what you might find, you in, say, Copenhagen, you'd find Viking remains. We have this extraordinary 19th century collection that older countries or older deposits like this, not older because we are super duperly old here, but it's the best 19th century collection because of the laws around its protection and the way it collects, and because they're really stringent about what goes in and how it goes in, and you can see the kind of housing here of the shoes. So it's quite fantastic.
Yeah, so Marissa has created all of those custom-made, all those boxes and mounts for those shoes so that they meet Heritage Victoria's requirements and guidelines and the ethics and protocols related to object conservation. And that's how they will go into the State Archive in those boxes with the session numbers and labels that all relate to the catalogue that Rhonda and Jamie put together. So it all can be researchable, and if you need to access the collection, you just have to apply to Heritage Victoria, and I'm sure they facilitate that in some way. It's probably not a quick process, but it's definitely available, and it's there for our collective use and research and knowledge. So, yeah, it's valuable.
The other thing about it too is they don't have a conservator. They did have a conservator and they worked out it wasn't cost effective. So which is one of the reasons that we've ended up being able to do it. Other conservators in Victoria do the conservation work. But the other thing about that is, as a conservator, you have to make sure to the best of your ability it's not going to need future treatment. In a museum, you would be going around and assessing whether things need treatment, and certainly Annie Newell will be looking at things, but she's the only curator. She's also would be, one of the Hatchland Rare's collection manager. She has to approve the conservation steps. So everything has to be as stable as possible, that it doesn't need a conservator to do any further work on it.
Yeah.
Is there any relationship between the museum and your state records, or how does that work?
So a lot of objects that's in the museum, for example, you might remember it's fairly popular, the Little Lonsdale exhibition that's been at the Melbourne Museum for years. So all of those artefacts, were excavated in Melbourne. The data that goes with them would have been, gone to Heritage Victoria, all of those records. So that's sort of an example of how these objects then can be displayed. So there's a fairly close relationship in terms of borrowing objects.
Wesley.
The Wesley Place, of course, yeah. And Wesley Place as well. The Wesley Church. So there's an interpretive display there where you can look at so many of the artefacts as well as a lot of the archaeological data that's been interpreted really beautifully for the public as part of that heritage trade.
It's great, you can just walk along and look at the windows and see all the little tea sets, and it's fabulous.
Yeah, we worked on it for a long time. So that was a big site that was excavated.
To keep checking on it. So those are on permanent display, and that's sometimes a requirement of the Heritage Act. The development might be allowed to proceed and damage or destroy archaeology, but we have to dig it first, we have to record it all, we have to report on it, we have to conserve the artefacts or a selection of them, and then sometimes an interpretive program is also required to be installed on the site. So at Wesley Place at 300 Lonsdale Street, it was a church complex that's redeveloped. part of that was developed and made for conservation of those buildings. If you ever get a chance, you just wander around that precinct. I have a whole series of buildings beautifully preserved, and we have an artefact display in there of artefacts that were recovered from a huge dig that our team did back in 2017, 2018, and there's also an online heritage interpretation on the website for the site as well. We have those QR code panels and a interpretive trail that's been set up there. So that's one example of how the Heritage Act requires that yes, it allows damage and destruction of archaeology, but it says that it also has to be done in this way under these conditions, and there has to be this process of conservation, retention of artefacts, heritage interpretation, and documentation. So that's how it's set up for archaeology. Any other questions? Have a really interested audience and great questions this evening. Anyway, thank you all, because you've been sitting here for a while, and I really appreciate your attention and just for coming along tonight. Thanks everyone for speaking.